to bring on Jeff Green, our Chief Executive Officer at Cal Nonprofits, to speak a little bit about Cal Nonprofits and give some context around the 2027 California budget.
Thanks, Robert, and good morning, everyone. We're happy you're here, spending some time with us and some of our favorite budget and policy analysts, who I'll get a chance to introduce in just a moment. To start off, I just want to say a few words for those of you that know Cal Nonprofits well. You know us well, and I don't need to explain. For those who may not, I want to give you just a quick overview of our work. So Cal Nonprofit's been around 41 years. We are three things primarily for the nonprofit sector here in the state of California. Policy and advocacy is our core. That is what we do to try to do all we can to make sure that the landscape in which all nonprofits work is as supportive and friendly and useful as possible to all of the fabulous mission work that we and you all do. We're just coming off of a day in Sacramento yesterday where we held our annual hearing with the joint select committees of on the nonprofit sector, which were actually two bodies that we helped to create, one in the Assembly and one in the Senate, discussing some of the issues that are always facing the sector and possible solutions. Some of you may know that this year we have a half dozen bills of which we are actual sponsor, so a larger legislative lift than in any prior year, and all are moving through both houses rather swiftly, and we expect those to be on the governor's desk by the end of the month. So lots happening as far as the policy and advocacy work goes. But the other part of that is always budget, and we're going to talk about budget today. Education, things like this, where we offer what we can to connect nonprofit leadership to the best resources and information, make introductions to some of the real expertise that we lean on and our colleagues about what may be happening in the sector, how policy changes, budget changes actually translate to what's happening on the ground. And then finally, data and research. And this is largely about, we all know how difficult it can be to find good data on the sector. And when we can find it, we want to share it and make sure people have access to it. And when we can't, on occasion, we will do our own research in partnership with various folks around the state. Right now, we're finishing up our cost as count research, which will give an economic snapshot of the power of the sector here in California. So that's what we do. We are a membership organization. We invite you to join us if you have not already. And now let's talk about today. So today we are going to put a little bit of context around the budget. For those of you that are neck deep in budget issues, you know how this all works. We salute you for that hard work. It is not easy. And we'll talk a lot about what this current budget that has now been passed means for the nonprofit sector, as well directly to the sector, but also just for the communities that we all serve, because much of what we do is often a direct response to where our resources are or are not showing up. And the California state budget is a big part of that. We're going to talk about the process. Those of you, again, who know this work well, have figured out how this process works. Again, thank you. For those of you that are newer to it, we want to make sure that you leave this hour knowing a bit more about how our budget is built every year and what those key points of leverage might be for us to all weigh in. I will say again here that we believe strongly that the nonprofit sector needs to be more, not less, politically engaged, and on that front, we need policy. Policy includes budget. So that firewall that keeps us out of partisan politics also makes it ever more possible for us to do all we can on the advocacy front. So we do that alongside many of you here that are on this call. We'll talk a little bit about the factors and players in the process. So whose job is to do what, by what time, where those negotiations happen, and around what the big issues are this year. We'll take a look at that final budget that was passed, and of course, talk about what that means. I will note that the revenue into the nonprofit sector and just 501c3 public charities here in California every year is approaching $450 billion, which is in fact larger than the state budget. So I always think it's important for us to make the point that we are a major economic force in California. So yes, we are nice people doing good things. We all know that. But in fact, what's probably at least as important when it comes to our leverage and our political power is to remind our legislators and others in positions of power that the nonprofit sector is a major economic driver and employer in the state of California. So with that as prelude, I want to bring up today's expert panel. These are two of our favorite colleagues, both with the California Budget and Policy Center, based out of Sacramento. We have with us both Scott Graves, who is the Budget Director, and Laura Pryor, who's the Research Director. If you've been with us before, you've seen how we do this, and I'm just going to get out of the way right now. Thank you both for doing this, for all the work you do day in and day out, and for sharing what you can this morning with those who have joined us.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you everyone for inviting us to today's webinar. We're really glad to be here with you all. So as mentioned, my name is Laura Pryor and I am the research director at the California Budget and Policy Center. We are a nonprofit that does research and analysis on our state budget, which is what we're here to talk to you about today. And I'm also joined by my colleague Scott Grays, our budget director. So before getting into all of the facts and figures about our state budget, I want to start by just talking about why we're talking about the state budget in the first place. So the state budget and the choices that go into the state budget answer a key question. And that key question is, what kind of California do we want to live in? So in other words, do we want the choices made in our state budget to help lift families out of poverty? Or the choices made in our state budget can also continue widening wealth inequality. So our state budget has the power to put California on either of these opposing paths, which is why it's critical, echoing what Jeff said, to be informed of our state budget process so that you all can help shape this direction. So with that said, let's get into our agenda for today. So first, I'm going to start by discussing some key facts about the state budget, talk about how California is generally shaped by our state budget and some advocacy opportunities. And then from there, I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague Scott, who's going to talk specifically about our enacted 2026-27 state budget. So that's where we're heading today. So let's jump right into those key facts about the state budget. So the first key fact that I like to share is that the state budget is made up of both federal sources and state sources. So taking a look at how this is all made up within our state budget, overall what you see in this donut chart is that the blue parts of the donut are our state sources. And the teal part is our federal sources. So about 1/3 comes from the federal government and about 2/3 come from state sources. So the majority comes from state revenue. However, that 1/3 coming from the federal government is still a pretty significant chunk of our overall state budget. So again, state budget, two sources of where the money's coming from, state and federal. So given that those state sources are the majority, let's take a closer look at the revenue that comes from the state sources. And it primarily comes from three main sources, which you'll see here in this donut chart. And these three sources are first our personal income tax. So the taxes that we all pay come every April, our sales and use tax, so taxes on goods and services, and our corporation tax. So the thing again to note here is that of the 2/3 overall coming into our state budget that's coming from state revenue sources, it's made up of these three main revenue streams. And these three main revenue streams, you might notice, are pretty tied to our economy. So when our economy is doing well, we're seeing more money come in through personal income tax, sales and use tax, corporation tax, and more money in our budget overall. However, when we have times of an economic downturn, less money is coming into our state budget. So this is generally where the money is coming from. So now let's turn to talking about how this money is appropriated or spent. So overall, the state budget supports a broad range of public services and systems. So let's take a closer look at these dollars and how they're divided up. First, looking at state funding. So how are those state revenue sources divided up? So this chart shows combined what we call general fund and what we call special fund spending for the current fiscal year, divided into three major budget categories. And the main takeaway from this slide is that almost 3/4 of these state dollars support three broad categories of public services. First, health and human services, which, as you can see, receives over 40% of these dollars. Next, K-12 education, which accounts for about 1/4 of these funds. And higher education, which receives about 7% of these state dollars. So again, these dark blue bars make up about almost 3/4 of how our state dollars are spent. And as you can see in the lighter blue bars, a smaller share of state dollars go to the state prison system, transportation, environmental protection, and other public services and systems. So again, this is how our state dollars are allocated. But what about those federal dollars? Again, about 1/3 of our budget overall. Let's take a look. So this chart shows that the vast majority of federal dollars that flow through California's state budget support health and human services programs, totaling more than $136 billion in the current fiscal year. So estimated federal funding for other services like K-12 education, higher education, those light blue bars that you see in this chart, it really does pale in comparison to the amount going to health and human services, that big orange bar. So now that we know where the money is coming from, generally how the money is spent, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the state budget from a different angle. So since I've been talking, I've been saying the state budget as if it is one thing. Well, in fact, the budget actually consists of a whole package of bills that is not just one single bill. Specifically, it's made up of what we call budget bills, trailer bills, and from time to time, other budget-related bills. So let's take a look at just really how massive this budget package is every year from a couple of perspectives. So first, let's actually talk about how many bills could be in this budget package. So it's typically 2 to 3 dozen. And this chart shows in 2025, so last year, the governor signed nearly 50 budget-related bills into law, which consisted of, as you can see in this chart, about 10 budget bills and 38 what we call, again, trailer bills. And in contrast, in 2024, state leaders enacted 33 budget-related bills, so it was about 15 fewer in 2024. So as just to underscore that, again, the budget is not one big bill. It is a package consisting of many bills. The amount of bills can fluctuate year to year. And another fun way, I think, of thinking about the state budget package and its massiveness is to actually look at how big, in terms of how many pieces of paper, the state budget is. So what you see in this picture is a ruler next to our state budget. So as you can imagine, it is thousands of pages. So the budget-related bills, they can be really short or really long. Just to get a sense of scope, the longest bill signed in 2025, the Budget Act, exceeded 900 pages. And the shortest bill, 3 of them, came in at just around 3 pages each. So again, the budget is not one bill, it is a series of bills. Each bill can be up to 900, as low as 3, maybe even more than 900 in some instances. So that hopefully gets at some of the complexity and massiveness of our budget package. So with that behind us, in terms of our key facts, I want to move now to talking about some of the key players and some opportunities for advocacy. So talking about the key players, next slide. First, we're going to talk about what we call the big 3. So we have Governor Gavin Newsom on the far left, who took office in January 2019 and is now in his second and final term. The governor is one big key player, part of this big 3. Then we move to the legislator. The legislator consists of both the Senate and the Assembly. And on the Senate side, Monique Limon leads. She became the leader of the Senate in November 2025, officially President Pro Tem, as we say. And on the Assembly side, we have Robert Rivas, who's been serving as Speaker of the Assembly since fall 2023. And collectively, the legislator and the governor are known as the big 3 because of the pivotal role that they play in budget negotiations, which I'm going to get into more in the next slide. But first, I also want to mention that, last but not least, the public also has their say through the budget process. And again, I'll talk more about the public's role and opportunities for advocacy a little bit later, but just wanted to provide this overview of the key players. So with that said, let's talk more about this big three. First, with the governor. So the governor has the lead role in crafting the state budget. So California has long had what we call an executive-centered budget process, which gives significant authority and power to the governor and the Department of Finance, which leads the development of the governor's budget proposals. So the governor essentially has three main bites at the budget apple, which we can see on this next slide. So specifically, the governor has his first bite at the apple in January of each year. The governor must release a proposed budget by January 10th. And this proposed budget and the major media attention it receives gives the governor the opportunity to lift up their budget priorities and really shape the narrative that Californians hear. So again, first bite at the apple, January 10th. Then next, the May revision comes out by May 14th of each year, and this gives the governor his second bite at the apple. And this revised budget is another opportunity for governors to shape the narrative, talk up their proposals just weeks before the legislator has to pass the initial budget bill. And finally, the governor plays a key role in budget negotiations with legislative leaders in May and June, and tends to get the last word in these discussions. So in California, governors have what we call line item veto authority, which gives them the ability to veto all or parts of appropriations. And even that threat of a line item veto gives the governor huge leverage to shape the budget, since legislators are very reluctant to override a governor's veto, especially when the governor and legislative leaders are from the same party. And as a result, differences tend to be worked out behind the scenes rather than aired in public, which, as you can imagine, tend to work in the governor's advantage. So as we all know, we are in the middle of a gubernatorial race, and hopefully these past few slides underscore the importance of the governor in shaping important California's decisions and the importance of engaging in our upcoming governor's race. So now that we understand the governor's role, let's talk about the legislator. So as mentioned, the legislator is also part of this big three because they play a key role in the budget process. Specifically, the legislator reviews, revises, and adds to the governor's proposal. So as mentioned on the previous slides, there's the first proposal in January and the May revise in May 14th. The legislator is taking the proposal, the revised budget in May, reviews, revises, and adds to this, which helps. And sometimes they do this with help from what we call the Legislative Analyst Office, commonly known as the LAO. So let's take a closer look at who these people are. So the key players here, so on the left side, our Senate side, we have Senator John Laird, who is the chair of what we call the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Then on the far right, on the Assembly side, we have Assembly Member Jesse Gabriel, and he is chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. And in the middle of the slide deck, we have Gabe Pettick, who is the state's legislative analyst. So he leads a team that provides nonpartisan fiscal and policy advice to the legislator. So as mentioned, Senator John Laird, Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, they lead the budget committees. And each of these budget committees is made up of multiple subcommittees. Specifically, there's 7 in the Assembly and 5 in the Senate. And what you see here on the screen is an example of an agenda from subcommittee number 2 on human services. And also it was a joint hearing with Assembly subcommittee number 2 and Assembly budget subcommittee number 3. So what exactly do these budget subcommittees do? Well, there's a few things that we think are important to know about budget subcommittees. So the first thing to know is that they focus on specific policy areas. So there's a subcommittee on education and a subcommittee on health and other key issue areas. Secondly, these budget subcommittees hold dozens of hearings from February to May. to review the governor's proposals, which they can approve, modify, or reject. And I do want to put a pin in this second bullet to note that these are public hearings. So thinking about opportunities for the public to engage, want to underscore that these are public hearings. Thirdly, these subcommittees meet with policy advocates, so members of the community, perhaps you have done this, to help understand priorities from the community, priorities from advocates, and gather intel on what's happening in a specific policy space. Fourthly, these budget subcommittees evaluate the budget asks submitted by advocates and legislators and decide which to include in their own budget plans that they work on throughout the spring. And lastly, they also finalize the Assembly and Senate versions of the budget, which are later combined into a unified legislative budget that is typically unveiled in late May or early June. So overall, that is the role of the big three. And as mentioned in my previous slide, the public also has a key role in shaping the budget process. So let's now turn to talking about the public. Again, members of the public can engage with policymakers to inform and influence budget choices. And I want to start this subsection by underscoring the fact that the most important thing, next slide, that members of the public can do in the budget process is build relationships with policymakers and their staff. So if we're thinking about how the public can influence the budget, first and foremost, relationship building is key. It is the foundation for effective budget advocacy. So the capital, Sacramento, next slide, runs on relationships. And it's really, as mentioned, important to lay that groundwork of influence by building that familiarity and trust with key players in the process, which we just went over. And fall, which we're coming up to, is really a great time to build or renew these relationships. So as you saw in that timeline slide where I went over the governor's role, the height of budget season is really January through the end of June. So come fall, staff are more likely to have time to take meetings compared to other times of the year when they might be more overwhelmed. I also want to note that turnover can be quite high in and around the Capitol. And so there might be, new legislators, new staffers, et cetera, a new administration coming. And advocates need to pay constant attention to relationship buildings because there's always somebody new coming in and out of the Capitol. So relationship building never ends. Again, key point here is that is the foundation for effective advocacy. So with that said, let's talk about some more specifics about specific ways that the public can make their voices heard in the state budget process. So there's a few key ways that I'm going to go over. One way is submitting a budget letter to policymakers outlining your budget priorities. So let's say after the January proposal, you hear about a cut to Medi-Cal that you are not in favor of. You could write and submit a budget letter to a policymaker, somebody in one of these budget subcommittees, for example, expressing your views. You could also schedule a meeting with key policymakers and staff in the legislature and in the governor's administration to share your perspective and priorities. Thirdly, as mentioned, those budget subcommittee hearings are public, which means you can come to Sacramento, attend a hearing, and provide public comment at the end of the hearing. And sometimes, if invited, advocates and community members are actually invited to testify as part of a panel at budget subcommittee hearings. And lastly, organizations across California are organizing what we call lobby days at the Capitol. And this is an opportunity for community members, advocates, to join forces with a broad range of organizations to focus state policymakers' attention on specific issues like childcare or healthcare. So again, what you see here, just a few key ways to make your voices heard in the budget process to influence how we're making our budget decisions. So with that said, I do want to talk a little bit about key moments for inserting public voice and advocacy throughout the year. And the first thing that's important to know here is that the budget process is cyclical. There is no real start and stop date. So while We do have a hard date for when the governor has to propose the budget in January. There is a hard date for when the final budget package should be signed. In reality, there is no off season for the state budget. Someone in Sacramento is always thinking about or working on the budget. So because these budget decisions and discussions are made throughout the year, there are specific opportunities in these windows or phases for advocacy, which I'm going to go over next. So these key windows are marked through these distinct periods that you see on this slide. So there's this July to December period that we're in right now, followed by a period between January and mid-May, and then lastly, mid-May to June. So now I'm gonna, at a high level, go over some key ways to get involved during each of these windows. So starting with July to December. As noted, this is when we're really entering into the fall after the height of budget season. So this is the quietest period of the budget process. There are still discussions being had. However, it's mostly behind the scenes, and it's really that key time, as mentioned, I can't underscore enough, to be doing that relationship building. It's time to familiarize yourself with who is my senator, who is my assembly member, and making those connections. So that's what's happening in the fall, relationship building, getting to know who your key policymakers are. So come the new year in January, this is really the heart of the budget process. This is the period with most consistent and transparent opportunities for public engagement. As mentioned, this is when we're having the most of those subcommittee budget hearings. This is a time when you can be traveling to Sacramento to go to the budget hearing, participating in lobby days, or finding a time to meet with policymakers to respond to what you're seeing in the proposed budget. So this is, again, heart of the budget process, January to mid-May. And lastly, we have this period from mid-May to June. This is the fastest period of the budget process. It is quick, and it can make advocacy challenging as policymakers can make major decisions in a very short period of time. And depending on how things are going in the budget with your priorities, it's also an opportunity to really focus your attention on the administration, because as mentioned, the governor really holds much of the power in crafting our state budget. So again, there's 3 distinct periods for advocacy. Budget happens all year round, and hopefully that provided a framework of what to do when. So I want to end this section by just reminding us and reiterating what I shared in the beginning, is that state budgets are reflections of our values and priorities as Californians. And I hope that this segment provided you with more information with how to engage in the state budget process to ensure that our state continues to advance priorities that help all Californians to thrive. So with that, I'm going to take a brief pause for any questions about anything I just shared, and then we'll transition to my colleague Scott, who will talk more specifically about our 2026-27 budget.
Laura, I wanted to note that there was one question that I just quickly answered in the Q&A. It was whether the legislature can pass trailer bills in the fall, and the answer is just yes, as long as they're in session. So I think everyone or most folks are aware that the legislature is closing out its business for the year on August 31st, less than 4 weeks. But if the governor were to call a special session in the fall, then yes, they could do more business. So that would be the one way in which this year, at least, they could pass more trailer bills in the fall.
Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
It looks like we've got one more question in the Q&A. Oh, we've got 2 more. The first one is, what is the best way to start that relationship building, especially if you're not able to go to the Capitol physically?
Yeah, well, I think it's the best way to start, particularly if you're not able to come to Sacramento, is finding out who your local assembly member and senator are. And they should have offices in your local area and getting to know their staffers. So it could be, maybe figuring out an event that they're attending in your local area. setting up a meeting, in that district that they represent that you live in. But again, first and foremost, it's figuring out who those people are, which you can do by visiting the Senate and Assembly websites. Anything else, Scott, that you would add to that?
That is what I was going to say. I think that's terrific advice, Laura.
Thank you.
The next question we have is around priorities, and this attendee asks, is there any way to know which issues take priority in the budget planning process? And I might be referencing back to those initial bar graphs that you spoke.
Yeah. I mean, certainly knowing the trends and how the appropriations have been made gives some sense, but I would say that again, everything goes back to that relationship building. So having conversations with legislative staffers early on to understand where their priorities are at would give you a sense of how things may or may not be funded in the upcoming fiscal year.
That makes sense. Thanks, Laura. One more question here that we have is, how are groups considering budget advocacy for 2027, 2028, given the coming gubernatorial transition? And maybe this is something that we'll touch on a little bit down the road, but if either of you
Yeah.
would like to speak to that now, please.
Yeah, I think this is a great segue to Scott.
Mhm.
And feel free to answer this question, Scott, and then we can transition to your section.
Great.
Yeah, well, just, one thing that comes to mind is that, we are in the nonprofit world allowed to engage with gubernatorial campaigns as long as we're reaching out to all campaigns. That really means both campaigns at this point. And so that is a great way to get in early, getting meetings with folks. Who on the governor's team do you want to be meeting with so that they know who you are, they know what your priorities are, what your issues are, and what you're hoping for next year. So there's no reason to wait until January or February to start engaging with, California's next governor, whoever that's going to be. You can start doing that right now. So probably getting started early would be good. I think probably good advice at this point.
Great. I'll turn it over to you, Scott, and let you take
Okay,
it away.
great. Thank you, Laura, for doing such a terrific job of providing an overview of the budget process. I wanted to shift gears now and talk about the 26-27 state budget. I am going to provide first a big picture overview, but I wanted to remind us that the ink hasn't been dry very long on the state budget, right? The governor signed the budget into law last June. He signed multiple trailer bills, some in June, some in July. The legislature passed an on-time budget for the 16th year in a row. Thank you, Prop 25, majority vote budgeting. We don't have years of delayed budgets anymore like we did 10, 20, and 30 years ago. So in addition to talking about sort of a big picture budget overview, I do want to hit on a few areas. Obviously, the budget is very long and in some ways unwieldy, as Laura was showing in some images in her presentation. So we're not going to be able to talk about everything, so maybe we can hit on some things in Q&A if we don't cover what you were hoping to hear. But I really want to be able to zero in on some tax and revenue choices that were made in the budget, food assistance choices, and some choices related to healthcare policy. So that's my plan for the next 15 or 20 minutes. So in terms of the state budget top lines from our perspective at the Budget Center, we see three positives. The first is that the budget enacted in June delays and rejects many of the harmful cuts that Governor Newsom proposed as part of his May revision. It was a pretty austere budget plan. It meant Californians would have been facing some difficult choices and decisions in their own lives if the state had gone ahead with some of the cuts that the governor was proposing. What happened in their final sort of big three negotiations was that the legislature was able to pull the governor sort of back into their orbit, and the budget adopted in June reflects more of the legislature's approach to the budget as opposed to Governor Newsom's approach that he was outlining in January as well as in May. A second point is that from our perspective, there are a couple of common sense proposals to raise new revenue, and I will touch on those in a moment. And this budget also provides some additional funding for food assistance healthcare, and programs to address homelessness, which really are, wins considering where those programs might have been if the governor's proposals had been adopted by the legislature. Having said that, there are a couple of concerns that I wanted to highlight here from our perspective. The first is that we don't think that this budget plan goes far enough to mitigate the harms from H.R. 1, right? The so-called One Big Beautiful Bill signed into law by President Trump a little over a year ago, which made devastating cuts, as you all know, to Medicaid, other healthcare programs, and food assistance in particular. And we also want to point out that this budget doesn't really propose the bold revenue solutions that we need to protect vital services and meet Californians' growing needs. So that's an issue that we're going to consider to raise and consider raising. We will be raising as an organization in the coming weeks and months, along with many other advocacy groups as well. Okay, so those are the top lines. Before I get into the weeds in a few policy areas, I wanted to provide a quick look ahead on what's next for the budget and statewide ballot measures. So in terms of the budget, this should sound very familiar to you since Laura just laid this out very well, that this month, the governor and legislators are going to be, I say likely revise here. In fact, they will be revising the June budget package, right? Just a few weeks ago, we thought, some people thought they put the budget to bed for the year. They never do that. They always come back in August and do various kinds of revisions. They'll pass another budget bill junior. They'll pass more trailer bills. So in other words, the budget related legislation will expand this month as they do some cleanup, as they make substantive changes to the budget package that they just put in place in June. And at the same time, as Laura noted, this administration, even though Governor Newsom is going to leave office very early next year, they still have to prepare a proposed budget for release on or before January 10th. So that will be happening. And whoever becomes California's next governor in November will also have an opportunity to engage with the Department of Finance to get their perspective and proposals to some extent included in the January plan. The reality is there's not a lot of time. And so what happens in these transitions is that the May revision really becomes the first opportunity to see what California's next governor is really going to prioritize in terms of a comprehensive plan for California. The January budget is very likely to be much more of sort of a plain vanilla placeholder type plan. In terms of ballot measures, we've all been hearing about how many we're going to be faced with in November. In fact, there are going to be 14 ballot propositions. 9 were put on through the signature gathering process, right? The citizens' initiatives. The other 5 were put on the ballot by the legislature. There are 5 tax-related measures that I'm going to talk about in a bit. And although I'm not going to talk about it, I also wanted to point out that there's one measure to strengthen California's rainy day fund, which is known as the Budget Stabilization Account. So get ready when you start receiving your ballots and your voter guide for a lot of information about those 14 ballot measures Californians are going to get to decide on in a few months. Okay, so let's turn to tax and revenue in terms of what that looks like in the state budget, as well as some of the measures that we're going to see on the November ballot. So the first point I want to make about how the budget treats revenue is that they decided to cap business tax credits. Many of you may be aware that very profitable corporations doing business in California are very good at not paying taxes, at paying as little as possible, and in some cases, zero to the state. And so what policymakers have been trying to do is to make sure that corporations are paying their fair share. So there has been a temporary $5 million cap on business tax credits, which corporations use to lower their taxable income and avoid, that's another way to avoid paying taxes to California. Legislature decided to maintain that cap through 2029. And then after that, there will be a permanent cap on these business tax credits, either at $5 million or 70% of a business's tax bill. So they took some action in terms of business tax credits to try to bring in more revenue from corporations. There's also a proposal they adopted that will apply the state sales tax to digital sales of software. So for example, this could be related to accounting or tax prep or maybe Microsoft Office, Excel. Keep in mind that if for some reason Microsoft decided to send you a CD, they thought it was 2005 and they had to send you a hard disk of some kind, you would pay sales tax on that because it's tangible property and that is subject to the sales tax in California. Digital downloads, no tax. So essentially what this does is says, wait a minute, we're still providing software to consumers and businesses. It's taxed if you get a tangible version of it. It's not taxed if it's digital. So they're applying across the board now this state tax and local tax on digital software downloads, which is actually going to help bring in additional revenue for state and local governments. So just what does that look like quickly in terms of revenue? At the state level, estimates are that we're going to raise from 1 billion to almost 6 billion in additional revenue from both of these tax changes. And then at the local level, over time, they're expected to receive across the state around $1 billion in additional funding. And that is strictly due to the sales tax on digital sales of software, because as you all know, there's a local portion of the sales tax that will help to support local governments. In terms of what's on the, one other thing I wanted to point out was that the budget also includes a plan out of the state Senate that was called the Fair Share from Big Corporations. The goal here is to explore a way to create a new assessment on big employers whose workers rely on Medi-Cal for health coverage because these employers do not provide affordable health care to their workers. So these folks end up coming to the state and enrolling in Medi-Cal, which of course is supported by you, me, every other taxpayer in California, as well as federal funds. So the Department of Finance under the budget is going to have to develop some draft legislation by next March. Again, this is not a new tax. This is just directing the governor's administration to present one or more options for how to structure a tax. And then they're going to continue to talk about it next year and see if they might include that as part of next year's budget package. Now, there is a fail-safe here. If for some reason, somehow the federal government repeals the H.R. 1 cuts, then this state requirement to develop these options would be paused. I think most of us can agree that even if the Democrats were to retake Congress, it seems very unlikely President Trump would ever sign a repeal of H.R. 1. So it just seems very likely that next year we're going to hear about ways to ensure that corporations that fail to provide affordable health coverage to their employees need to have some way of helping to cover the cost of that at the state level. I wanted to quickly turn to some of the tax measures on the November ballot, dividing them up into a couple of categories. The first category is those that would either preserve existing revenue or raise new revenue. There's a couple here. One is Prop 3, which would make permanent the existing tax rates on high-income earners that have been in place since 2012, going back to Prop 30. This would say, hey, they're already in place. Let's just keep them in place and make them permanent. This is because state budget revenues fluctuate. This is an impact on the budget of $5 billion to $15 billion per year. If Prop 3 passes, no problem, stays in place, no issues. If voters say no to Prop 3, then eventually state policymakers will have to figure out how to close a $5 to $15 billion annual hole in the state budget. Then, of course, we've all been hearing about the billionaire tax, right? Prop 40 imposing a one-time 5% tax on the wealth of billionaires, with most of this money going to support Medi-Cal and other healthcare programs. There are potential one-time revenues here in the tens of billions of dollars, but our recently published analysis of Prop 40 points out that there's a lot of uncertainty around Prop 40 and some trade-offs that voters are going to need to consider when they decide on Prop 40. There are also 3 tax measures on the ballot that would make it harder to raise revenue. I'm going to point out 41 and 42 together, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about them other than they were bankrolled by California billionaires who don't like Prop 40, don't want Prop 40 to pass. These are designed to stop or undermine Prop 40 indirectly or directly. And then there's also Prop 43, which would require a supermajority 2/3 voter approval for any new local special tax put on the ballot by voter initiative. The current threshold is a simple majority. So if in your city or county you say, hey, We want more money for the local library. Let's put a 1/4 cent sales tax increase on our local ballot through the petition process, right? We're not going through the city council or county board of soups. It's just we want to do it as citizens of this area. Right now, you can do that by majority vote. If Prop 43 passes, it would be, no, sorry, you gotta get your 2/3 supermajority vote to put your library tax in place. So those are 5 key measures on the November ballot that deal with tax and revenue. I'm really switching gears now here because I'm going to talk about a couple of areas with expenditures in the state budget. We heard from your hosts that you're all particularly interested in food assistance and health, so that's where we're putting the focus here. In terms of food assistance programs, there is some good news that many of you, I'm sure, have heard about. There's additional funding for food bags coming through the Cal Food program. There's a couple $100 million for counties to help them implement the new CalFresh work requirements put in place by H.R. 1. And they are also continuing at the state level to plan an expansion of CFAP, the California Food Assistance Program, to undocumented older adults in October of 2027. There is a however here. The budget decided not to include the legislature's proposal to fund some automation changes that would allow the state to expand CFAP to lawfully present immigrants who lost eligibility for CalFresh due to H.R. 1. So the legislature and governor punted on that issue. They may come back to it next year, but this is a group of folks who have historically been eligible for SNAP or CalFresh assistance, and they just got kicked off because of H.R. 1. And now that we're trying to find a way to help them maintain vital food assistance for their families, but that was not included in the budget package this year. Turning to healthcare, I'm watching the time. I'm not going to go into as much detail here as I had originally thought, but I want to point out what you're all aware of is that we are facing significant budget pressures in California as we respond to the deep cuts in H.R. 1. On the one hand, the budget passed in June is generally maintaining the Medi-Cal reductions that were previously adopted by the state. A lot of these cuts target immigrant populations who had been made eligible for Medi-Cal. The state was looking for ways to, quote, save money, so they were rolling back some of the benefits and eligibility. Those are largely remaining in place. But on the other hand, the budget is also preserving many core health programs. There are several delays to some of the proposed cuts, and they are investing in the implementation of new federal requirements. These are areas where H.R. 1 is requiring counties in the state to do certain things we didn't have to do before. And of course, they don't provide money for it. So the state has to cough up the money to pay for new H.R. 1 requirements. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I did want to point out that many of the healthcare decisions made at the state and federal levels are directly impacting immigrants, not just undocumented immigrants, but immigrants with humanitarian status, lawfully present immigrants. We're finding that government at the state and federal levels has been looking for ways to roll back healthcare coverage for many, many people who contribute to our communities, immigrants, who now are finding it much more challenging to maintain affordable health coverage for themselves and their families as a result of all the changes. You will receive the slide deck. I'm not going to go over all the text on here, but you'll be able to review it later. And then finally, I wanted to point out that the budget does include funding to support counties and hospitals. So there's a few $100 million to help counties implement H.R. 1, over a couple $100 million for designated public hospitals who are facing uncompensated care costs due to people losing Medi-Cal and showing up at their doors for health coverage that has to be provided. And there's also $90 million to help out hospitals facing financial distress, with authority for up to $50 million more in funding if they need it. So with that, I'm going to close out my overview here of some of the content of the state budget. Remind you all that we do have a Budget Academy hub. You can get to it through our website or through budgetacademy.org. The whole point of this hub is to give you the tools and resources that you need to better understand the budget process, engage with it to drive meaningful change. So with that, I think we might have a little time for questions if you have any related to going back to Laura's presentation or even the one that I just finished. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott. And thanks for hopping back on, Laura. We do have some questions, and we have covered a lot of ground today, so I appreciate um, you both moving through the material in a way that's easy to understand, um, and also give some comprehensive answers to some of these questions. I think the Budget Hub is one of the resources that I'm going to highlight in my follow-up email. It seems like a great place for people to start. I have a question from Lisa, and Lisa asks, how is the current legislature addressing the fact that California depends on the federal government for 1/3 of its budget when the Fed priorities seem to be opposite of our state priorities? And I think this is a question that a lot of people think about, especially because California is a donor state, right? Um, if either of you have thoughts on Lisa's question, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, well, I'll start. I do want to point out that we have an analysis on our website published last summer that looks at California's donor state status, and I believe we'll be updating that again as data come out on an annual basis. But yes, California does send more in taxes to the federal government than we receive back. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We are a single country, and there's no reason why every dollar we send to the Fed should directly come back to California. Otherwise, what's the point of having a union and a federal government? Having said that, when the feds make big budget reductions, it is very challenging for any state to completely close the hole, right? We are facing ongoing federal cuts of tens of billions of dollars. And it is just honestly very challenging for any single state, including California, to raise those kinds of sums in order to totally or fully backfill the cuts that are coming. So I think what they've been trying to do is find ways to mitigate the harm. Some ways you can do that without spending more money. In other ways, we are going to have to spend more money, billions of dollars, and it's going to impact other budget priorities that may get squeezed, or they're going to, like we've been making the case for, needing more revenues. What's really sad is we are needing to raise revenues as a state just to make up for cuts proposed by the federal government, which means we're not expanding programs, we're treading water. We're making sure that programs that are currently available to Californians can continue to be available to them, but to the extent we're using our revenues for that purpose, we are not able to invest them in robust program expansion. So they just really put the squeeze on us when they make decisions at the federal level that are good for them and not good for the states.
Thanks, Scott. Anything to add there, Laura? I think it was well covered.
Yeah, nothing to add. Thank you, Scott.
We have another question about advocating and interacting with the folks who are making decisions at the state level. And the question is, do constituent letter campaigns, phone calls, etc., really work? What kind of volume is significant enough to get attention and make a difference?
I can start. I don't think I have a single answer for that, but I can give an example. So this year for childcare that's funded by the state, there was a proposal to not deliver on a promise to expand new affordable childcare spaces, and B, cut affordable childcare spaces. So there's a local group called Parent Voices California, should call them a California-based group, and they mobilize parents to make phone calls. And over the course of the budget cycle, they made around 900 phone calls to policymakers.
Oh.
And at the end of the day, the cuts were reversed. So we didn't see the cuts in the final budget that were proposed. And we got about half of the affordable spaces that were promised. So there was a lot of advocacy that went into it. And I wouldn't say it was only because of those 900 phone calls, but it was a huge part of, the whole effort, right? And that just perhaps provides one example in our childcare space for the volume that happened for a specific advocacy.
I just want to quickly say that if y'all are going to send like form letters, like it's like, hey, suggested language and sign your name, put your organization on it. We've been told by budget committee staffers, do not send those to budget committee consultants' email addresses, right? Send them to the email addresses listed at the top of the Senate Budget and Assembly Budget Committee websites, because if you send them to the budget committee consultants, you are spamming them and you are very likely to get blocked by them and they'll never hear from you again. So
Wow,
yeah.
super. That's a great note. I might ask Jeff to come back on if he's here. We have a couple of questions, particularly for nonprofits. And the question that stands out to me here is, do the candidates actually care what a nonprofit has to say if they are regional and have a small operating budget?
I do actually, and I think Laura's advice on building relationships is outstanding. That you want to have those relationships in place for the time when you really need to talk about something serious. So building them at a time where there's not an immediate ask, it's just like fundraising. You build those relationships over time, and then when there's an opportunity to act, you're in a good position to have a conversation because you've got some trust and some knowledge of each other. What we do at Cal Nonprofits obviously is try to build the political power and footprint in Sacramento. But we do that largely through asking local members, no matter how small or large, to speak directly to their elected, because that's the constituency they care most about. And time again is in all forms of democracy across the spectrum, that really is true. I think the one disadvantage we have is we can't then move campaign contributions behind our relationships, and elected officials are also aware of that. But we do see a real effect of organizing nonprofit voices of all sizes to move issues with their electeds in both houses. It takes time though, and I want to be really clear. This is generational work. It's not a quick meeting and a good story, and then they change their mind because there's so much else going on. But over time, I'm an optimist and a firm believer that it does work. But I would welcome Scott or Laura to challenge that notion or reinforce it.
Well, Jerry asks kind of a similar question. It would be great to learn about more ideas for nonprofits and social enterprises to address the needs of individuals that are being most affected. Creating innovative approaches seems more effective if we collaborate to learn from the most likely impact residents and organizations that we can contribute more effectively. I mean, I think Jeff, you really covered it there in creating those relationships, and it's not this is not a short-term game, right? This is a long-term process that involves creating relationships and then nurturing.
What I would say is nonprofits need to position themselves in their rightful place as experts on the ground. And I think that's where we've often fallen down historically. And so there's a lot of us out here trying to build those networks and reposition the fact, we don't want to be the ones after the fact, after something's been done, to have to say, no, wait, this is why that was a bad decision. We need to be the ones that they call first. And that's really the long-term goal, is make yourselves the go-to when someone needs information about childcare, food security, gender equity, fair pay, environmental, climate work, whatever the issue is.
Make yourself the expert.
Yeah.
Great. One more question as we run right out of time here. Can you give a quick update on Prop 4, the environmental funding and transportation note in the budget? Is that too in the weeds for you all?
Well, I think it's a little too in the weeds. Yeah. Yeah, you should feel free to email us if you want more information, and we can try to point you in the right direction.
Lonnie, I'll send over some resources as well to try and address that question. But with that, we've come to 12 o'clock. And so I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, both the registrants as well as our two panelists. Scott and Laura, it's always so nice to have you joining us to explain the California budget and the key players, the factors in the process. And then I'd also like to thank the registrants for joining us and lending your voice in the chat as well as the questions. It's always nice to hear what folks are thinking about in the field and what affects them most. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful afternoon, and we will look forward to seeing you at future Count on Profits educational events. Take care.